"Why did you come? We don't want you," said my daughter-in-law at her baby shower, which I paid for. I just smiled and answered, "I'll go, but first, meet someone you tried to forget." She didn't answer. She screamed. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. I adjusted my green dress for the third time, smoothing wrinkles that weren't there. The mirror in my bedroom reflected a woman I barely recognized anymore. 65 years of living etched into every line, but my eyes still held the fire that had carried me through decades of building a life from nothing. Today, that fire would serve me well. The invitation lay crumpled in my wastebasket, where I'd thrown it 2 weeks ago, then retrieved it, smoothed it out, and read it again. Baby shower for Mandy Jones. Saturday, 2 p.m., registry at Bloomingdale's. My son Kirk's wife, expecting their second child. My second grandchild, if I was still allowed to claim that title. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd paid for this very shower. The venue rental, the catering, the decorations, all charged to the credit card I'd given Kirk for emergencies. $4,000 for a party I wasn't welcome at. The bitter taste of that realization still coated my tongue, like medicine I couldn't swallow. I picked up my purse, checking once more that everything was in place. The cashier's check for the baby's trust fund, $25,000 I'd planned to present today. And tucked in the side pocket, a manila envelope that had arrived 3 days ago, delivered by a private investigator I'd hired 6 months earlier. Sometimes patience was its own form of power. The drive to the country club took 45 minutes, giving me time to rehearse what I might say, though I suspected no rehearsal could prepare me for what was coming. Classical music filled the car. Vivaldi's Four Seasons, the same piece that had played during my wedding to Kirk's father 38 years ago. Back then, I'd believed in happy endings. I'd raised Kirk alone after George died when Kirk was 12, worked 2 jobs to keep him in private school, sacrificed vacations and new clothes, and sometimes dinner so he could have violin lessons and soccer camps and everything a growing boy needed. I'd been mother and father both, cheerleader and disciplinarian, the steady presence that held our small world together. When Kirk met Mandy 5 years ago, I'd been hopeful. She was beautiful, certainly. Glossy brown hair and perfect teeth, the kind of polished confidence that came from private schools and trust funds. I'd welcomed her with open arms, included her in family traditions, shared stories of Kirk's childhood, and genuinely tried to build a relationship. The first crack appeared during their engagement dinner. Mandy had corrected me when I mentioned Kirk's middle name, Arthur, after his grandfather. "It's not Arthur anymore," she'd said with a tight smile. "We're changing it to Larry. Arthur is so common." Kirk had said nothing, just looked at his plate while I felt something cold settle in my chest. After their wedding, the distance grew methodically, precisely. Holidays became too complicated for me to attend. Sunday dinners shifted to Saturdays, then became monthly, then quarterly. Phone calls went unreturned. When their first child, Evangeline, was born, I learned about it from a neighbor who saw the announcement in the local paper. I pulled into the country club parking lot, noting the sea of luxury SUVs and imported sedans. Through the windows of the banquet room, I could see pastel decorations and women in designer dresses holding champagne flutes. My absence had clearly not diminished the festivities. The hostess at the front desk looked up with practiced politeness. "Mrs. Jones, I don't see your name on the guest list." "I'm the grandmother," I said simply, and something in my tone made her step aside. The banquet room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Pink and white balloons formed an elaborate arch over a table laden with gifts. Mandy sat in the center of it all like a queen holding court, radiant in a flowing white dress, one hand resting on her rounded belly. She was telling some animated story to a circle of women who hung on every word. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene. These women, Mandy's friends, her mother, her sister, they all knew me as the awkward presence Mandy barely tolerated. The grandmother who tried too hard, who didn't understand that money was the only contribution they wanted from me. Mandy's laughter cut through the room like crystal. And then she saw me. The sound died in her throat. Conversation around her faltered, then stopped entirely as heads turned in my direction. "Alice!" Mandy's voice carried across the sudden silence. She didn't stand, didn't smile. "What are you doing here?" I walked toward her with measured steps, my heels clicking against the polished floor. The room felt like a courtroom, and I was both judge and defendant. "I came to celebrate my grandchild," I said, "and to give you this." I held up the envelope containing the trust fund check. Mandy's mother, Clara, materialized beside her daughter like a protective shield. "This is a private event, Alice. Family only." The words hit like a slap, but I'd been preparing for this moment longer than they knew. "Family?" I repeated, tasting the irony. "Yes, let's talk about family." Mandy struggled to her feet, her face flushed. "You weren't invited. You know you weren't invited. We've been through this." "Have we?" I set my purse down on a nearby chair, the gesture deliberate and final. "Because I've been thinking about family a lot lately, about the ties that bind us and the secrets we keep." Something flickered in Mandy's eyes, a shadow of uncertainty. "I don't know what you're talking about." I smiled then. The same smile I'd perfected during board meetings when competitors underestimated me. During parent-teacher conferences when teachers suggested Kirk wasn't bright enough for advanced classes. During the lean years when creditors called. But I knew better days were coming. "Oh, but I think you do." I reached into my purse and withdrew the manila envelope, holding it like a playing card I'd been saving for the final hand. "You see, I've had some interesting conversations recently with people from your past, people you thought would never find you." The color drained from Mandy's face. Around us, the other guests had gone completely silent, sensing drama but not understanding its source. Even the caterers had stopped serving, frozen in place like actors waiting for their cue. "Why did you come?" Mandy's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the room, every word carried. "We don't want you." There it was. The truth spoken aloud at last. No more pretense, no more polite excuses, just the raw honesty of rejection delivered in front of 40 witnesses while standing next to gifts I'd paid for in a room I'd funded, celebrating a grandchild I'd never be allowed to know. I felt something shift inside me, like a lock finally turning after years of trying different keys. The hurt was still there. It would always be there. But beneath it rose something stronger. Something that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. "I'll go," I said, my voice steady as granite. "But first, let me introduce you to someone you tried very hard to forget." I opened the envelope and withdrew a single photograph, holding it so only Mandy could see. Her reaction was immediate and devastating. A sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her throat, her carefully composed mask shattering like dropped china. But I wasn't finished. From the envelope steps, I pulled out a second item. A business card, crisp and white, with elegant lettering that spelled out a name Mandy hadn't heard spoken aloud in 7 years. When Mandy saw it, when she recognized the name printed there, she screamed. The sound cut through the room like a siren, raw and primal and filled with a terror that turned every head in our direction. Conversations died mid-sentence. Someone dropped a plate. In the sudden, echoing silence that followed,
I heard my own heartbeat, steady and strong. Mandy staggered backward, her face white as paper, one hand clutching the back of her chair for support. "No," she whispered. "No, you couldn't have. She wouldn't. You don't know anything." I tucked the photograph and business card back into the envelope, my movements calm and deliberate, while chaos bloomed around me. "Actually, Mandy, I know everything." The silence that followed Mandy's scream stretched, like a taut wire ready to snap. 40 pairs of eyes shifted between my daughter-in-law's ashen face and my own composed expression. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking, measuring the seconds of Mandy's unraveling. "Alice, what is this about?" Clara stepped closer to her daughter, her voice sharp with protective instinct. "What are you doing to her?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched Mandy sink into her chair, one hand pressed against her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside her ribcage. Her carefully applied makeup had begun to streak at the corners of her eyes, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked fragile, breakable. "Mandy knows exactly what this is about," I said, my voice carrying across the room like a judge delivering a verdict. "Don't you, dear?" "Please." The word escaped Mandy's lips like a prayer. "Please don't do this. Not here, not now." The desperation in her voice should have stirred my maternal instincts, should have made me want to protect her, comfort her, find some gentle way to handle whatever secret lay between us. But I thought of Evangeline, my 3-year-old granddaughter whom I'd seen exactly twice since her birth. I thought of Christmas gifts I sent that were never acknowledged, birthday cards returned to sender. I thought of Kirk, my son, who now answered my calls with polite distance, as if I were a distant acquaintance rather than the woman who'd raised him alone. The maternal instinct died a quiet death. "Oh, but Mandy," I said, opening the envelope again, "surely your friends would love to hear about your time in Phoenix, about your work at Sunset Manor, about Mrs. Vivian Schmidt, if possible." Mandy went even paler. She gripped the arms of her chair so tightly, her knuckles went white. Around us, the other guests leaned forward with the collective hunger of people sensing scandal, but not yet understanding its nature. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mandy whispered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. From the envelope, I withdrew a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline was still clear. "Elderly woman dies after nursing home neglect allegations." I held it up. Not quite high enough for others to read, but positioned so Mandy could see every word. "Phoenix Herald, August 15th, 7 years ago," I said. "Quite a story. Vivian Schmidt, 83 years old, died of complications from infected bed sores. The family sued Sunset Manor for negligence. Do you remember Vivian, Mandy? You should. You were her primary caregiver." Mandy's sister, Alva, moved closer. "Jess, what is she talking about?" "It's nothing," Mandy said quickly. "It's just, there was a misunderstanding at my old job. Nothing came of it. But I could see in her eyes that she knew I had more. Much more." "Nothing came of it?" I repeated thoughtfully. "Well, that's technically true. The lawsuit was settled out of court, sealed records, non-disclosure agreements all around. Very expensive for Sunset Manor. Very convenient for you." I reached into the envelope again and withdrew a second photograph, this one showing a young woman in scrubs standing next to an elderly lady in a wheelchair. The woman in scrubs had Mandy's face, but 7 years younger, softer around the edges. The old woman looked frail but alert, her eyes bright with intelligence. Vivian was quite wealthy, wasn't she? No family, just a trust fund worth about $3 million. all left to various charities upon her death, except, I paused, letting the word hang in the air like smoke, except for the $50,000 that mysteriously disappeared from her account 2 weeks before she died, withdrawn in small amounts over several days, always during your shifts. Mandy shot to her feet with surprising speed for someone 7 months pregnant. You can't prove anything. The police investigated and found nothing. Nothing. The police investigated a theft, I agreed. But they never knew about the other thing, did they? About the medication records you falsified? About the pain medication you withheld from a dying woman so you could sell it on the side? The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, the scrape of chairs as people leaned forward or pulled back in shock. Clara grabbed Mandy's arm, her face a mask of confusion and horror. That's not true, Mandy said, but her voice cracked. None of that is true. You're lying. I withdrew the final item from the envelope, a small digital recorder, the kind private investigators used. Am I? Because I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with someone who worked with you at Sunset Manor. Someone who's been carrying the guilt of staying silent for 7 years. Someone who's finally ready to tell the truth. Mandy's legs gave out and she sank back into her chair. The fight drained from her face, leaving behind something hollow and desperate. Play it, someone called from the back of the room. I couldn't see who, but their voice carried the hunger of a crowd that smelled blood. Oh, I don't think that's necessary right now, I said, slipping the recorder back into the envelope. This is a baby shower, after all. A celebration. Mandy looked up at me with something that might have been relief, but I wasn't finished. Of course, I do have lunch plans tomorrow with Detective Rubin from the Phoenix Police Department. Lovely man. We're going to discuss some new evidence that's come to light. Amazing how witnesses find their courage after a few years, isn't it? No, Mandy's voice was barely audible. Please, Alice, I have children. I'm pregnant. Please.
I felt an echo of the sympathy that had once made me want to welcome her into our family, to be the mother-in-law who offered wisdom instead of judgment. Then I remembered the last time I tried to visit Evangeline, how Mandy had stood in the doorway of their house, the house I'd helped them buy, and told me they were just too busy for a visit. How she'd closed the door while I was still speaking, leaving me standing on their porch like a salesperson they couldn't be bothered to refuse politely. You should have thought of that before you decided I wasn't family, I said. Kirk's voice cut through the room like a blade. Mom, what the hell is going on here? I turned to see my son standing in the doorway, still in his work clothes, his face flushed from running. Someone must have called him, though I couldn't imagine Mandy wanting him to witness this particular conversation. Kirk, I said, and despite everything, my voice softened when I spoke his name. I was just leaving. No, you're not. He strode across the room, his eyes moving between Mandy's tear-stained face and my composed expression. Not until someone explains what's happening here. Mandy reached for him with desperate hands. She's lying, Kirk. She's making up terrible things about me. She's trying to ruin our family. Kirk looked at me, and for a moment, I saw the boy he'd once been, the child who'd come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting me to fix whatever was wrong. Mom? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who now stood protective over a woman who'd stolen him from me bit by bit, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, I was too strong for that, but crack like ice under pressure. Ask her about Vivian Schmidt, I said quietly. Ask her about Phoenix. Ask her why she really left Arizona. Kirk turned to Mandy and I saw the moment when doubt crept into his expression. Jess, what is she talking about? Mandy opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came.
I picked up my purse and walked toward the door, leaving the envelope on the gift table like one final present. The trust fund check is in there too, I said over my shoulder. $25,000 for the baby. Consider it a going-away gift. Alice, wait. Clara's voice stopped me at the threshold. When I turned, I saw she was holding the newspaper clipping, her face grave. Is this real? Every word, I said. Your daughter is very good at hiding who she really is. But then, you probably know that already, don't you? I walked out into the spring afternoon, leaving behind the chaos I'd created with surgical precision. Behind me, I could hear raised voices, tears, the sound of a family beginning to splinter along lines I'd carefully drawn. My hands shook only slightly as I unlocked my car. 7 months of investigation, 7 months of digging through Mandy's past, 7 months of building a case that would destroy the woman who destroyed my relationship with my son. The first phase was complete. Now came the harder part. Living with what I'd done and deciding exactly how far I was willing to go to reclaim what had been stolen from me. I drove home through streets lined with cherry blossoms, their pale pink petals falling like snow, beautiful and merciless, just like revenge. I sat in my kitchen the next morning nursing my second cup of coffee and watching the sunrise paint my garden in shades of gold. The newspaper lay folded beside my plate, but I couldn't concentrate on the headlines. My phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Clara, Alva, even some of Mandy's friends from the shower. I'd let every call go to voicemail. The only call I answered was from Detective Rubin in Phoenix. Mrs. Jones. His growly voice carried the weight of 25 years on the force. I've reviewed the materials you sent. This is quite compelling evidence. I thought you'd find it interesting, I said, stirring cream into my coffee with steady hands. The witness you mentioned, Miss Gall, she's willing to testify? Helen has been carrying this guilt for 7 years. I said she's ready to do the right thing. There was a pause on the line. You understand that if we reopen this case, it could get very messy. The original settlement, the sealed records, there will be lawyers involved, media attention. I understand perfectly. And your daughter-in-law, she has children. For just a moment, I hesitated. Evangeline's face flashed in my mind. 3 years old, with Kirk's dark eyes and Mandy's delicate features. The grandchild I barely knew who would grow up with her mother's crimes casting shadows over her childhood. Detective Rubin, I said finally. Vivian Schmidt had no children to speak for her when she died alone and in pain. Someone needs to be her voice. I'll be in touch, he said, and hung up. I was washing my coffee cup when the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass, I could see Kirk's tall silhouette. He stood on my porch for a full minute before I opened the door. And when I did, I barely recognized my own son. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, who'd spent the night having conversations that changed everything he thought he knew about his life. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside, and he walked past me into the living room where he'd grown up, where I had helped him with homework and bandaged his injuries and celebrated his achievements. He looked around as if seeing it for the first time, then sank into the armchair that had been his father's. Is it true? He asked without preamble.
Which part? All of it? Any of it? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was struggling with a difficult problem. She won't talk to me, Mom. She just keeps saying you're lying. But she won't explain anything. She won't tell me about Phoenix, about this Vivian woman, about why you would make something like this up. I sat across from him on the sofa, choosing my words carefully. What do you think, Kirk? I think, he stared at his hands, I think I don't know my wife at all. The pain in his voice should have made me feel victorious. Instead, it carved something hollow in my chest.
This was my son, my child, and I was watching him break apart piece by piece. She was different when we met, he continued, guarded. Said her family was complicated, that she'd had to leave Arizona because of some trouble at work. I thought it was just office politics or something. I never pushed. And now I'm wondering what else she hasn't told me. He looked up at me and I saw the boy he'd been when his father died, lost, searching for someone to make sense of a world that had suddenly become foreign. The money in Evangeline's college fund. It came from somewhere. Mandy said her grandmother left her an inheritance, but the timing matches when Vivian Schmidt died. I finished. Kirk closed his eyes. Jesus. My daughter's education is being paid for with stolen money? We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear Janice walking her dog, the same routine she'd follow for the 15 years she'd lived next door. Normal life, continuing as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis. Why now? Kirk asked finally. Why didn't you tell me this before? Would you have believed me? He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. We both knew the truth. 2 days ago, if I had approached him with accusations about Mandy's past, he would have dismissed me as a jealous mother-in-law, unable to accept that her son had chosen someone else. She's been pulling you away from me for 5 years, I said, slowly, methodically, making me the problem, the burden, the embarrassment. I became the mother-in-law who tried too hard, who didn't understand boundaries, who needed to learn her place. Mom, You didn't have to say anything. You just stopped calling, stopped visiting, started making excuses for why I couldn't be part of your life, your children's lives. I kept my voice level, factual. I spent 6 months wondering what I'd done wrong. Then I started wondering what she'd done right. Kirk was quiet for a long time, processing this. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. The private investigator. How long have you been looking into her? 7 months. Since Evangeline's 3rd birthday party, when Mandy told me I couldn't come because it was immediate family only. I should have said something then. Should've, could've, didn't. I shrugged. The past is what it is, Kirk. The question now is what you're going to do with the truth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What do you want me to do? It was the question I've been asking myself since yesterday afternoon. What did I want? Justice for Vivian Schmidt? Revenge against Mandy? My son back in my life? My relationship with my granddaughter restored? All of the above seemed greedy. Some of it might be impossible. I want you to be a father who protects his children, I said finally. Whether that means protecting them from their mother's past or protecting them from their grandmother's truth, that's your choice to make. Kirk stood abruptly and walked to the mantelpiece, where photographs of his childhood still sat in silver frames. Him at 10, grinning with a missing front tooth. Him at 16, awkward in a tuxedo before prom. Him at 25 on his wedding day with Mandy, radiant beside him in white lace. He picked up the wedding photo, staring at it as if it held answers. She wants to move, he said without turning around. Last night, after everything calmed down, she said, maybe we should relocate, start fresh somewhere new for the family. Where? She suggested Oregon or Washington, somewhere far from here. Of course she did. Mandy had run from Phoenix when her crimes caught up with her, and now she wanted to run again, take Kirk and the children and disappear before Detective Rubin could build his case, before the truth could destroy the life she'd built on lies. And what did you tell her? Kirk set the photograph down carefully, aligning it with mathematical precision on the mantelpiece. I told her I needed time to think. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and felt my pulse quicken. It was from Helen Gahn in Phoenix. Detective called me this morning. I'm flying in tomorrow to give my statement. Thank you for giving me the courage to finally speak up. I showed Kirk the message. His face went pale as he read it. It's really happening, isn't it? He said. This isn't just threats. You're actually going to destroy her? I'm going to make sure Vivian Schmidt gets justice. If that destroys Mandy... I took the phone back, deleting the message with deliberate fingers. Well, she should have thought about that 7 years ago. Kirk walked to the mantelpiece, looking out at the street where he'd learned to ride a bike, where he'd played with neighborhood children, where I'd taught him that actions had consequences and that running from problems only made them worse.
Evangeline asks about you, he said quietly. She wants to know why Grandma Alice doesn't come to see her anymore. The words hit like a physical blow, but I absorbed the pain without flinching. And what do you tell her? I tell her, you're busy. But she's smart, Mom. She knows something's wrong. Children usually do. He turned from the window and I saw something had changed in his expression. A hardening around the eyes, a set to his jaw that reminded me of myself. If Mandy did what you say she did, if she really stole from that old woman, if she let her suffer, then she's not the person I married. No, I agreed. She's not. And if she's not that person, then everything about our marriage is built on a lie. I watched my son come to this realization, watched him follow the logical path from discovery to conclusion. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to soften the blow somehow. But another part, the part that had been systematically erased for my grandchildren's lives, remained silent. Kirk pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then he dialed a number I recognized as his office. Donovan, it's Kirk. I need to take some time off. Family emergency. Yes, starting immediately. I don't know how long. 3 days passed before I heard from Kirk again. 3 days of silence that stretched like an eternity, filled only by the sound of my own thoughts and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in my hallway. I kept myself busy, tending my garden, organizing closets that were already organized, preparing meals I barely touched, anything to avoid thinking about the conversation with Detective Rubin, or Helen Gahn's flight arriving tomorrow, or the family I might have destroyed in my pursuit of justice. On Wednesday evening, Kirk appeared at my door again. This time, he wasn't alone. Evangeline stood beside him, her small hand engulfed in his much larger one, her dark eyes wide with curiosity as she looked up at the grandmother she barely remembered. She wore a yellow sundress with tiny daisies embroidered on the collar, and her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids that reminded me painfully of Kirk at that age. "Grandma Alice?" she said tentatively, and the sound of her voice, sweet and uncertain, nearly undid me completely. "Hello, sweetheart," I managed, crouching down to her level. Up close, I could see she had Mandy's delicate bone structure, but Kirk's steady gaze. "You've gotten so tall." Evangeline giggled. "Daddy says I'm growing like a weed." "What's a weed, Grandma Alice?" Before I could answer, Kirk stepped forward. "Evangeline, why don't you go see if Grandma has any books you might like to look at? I remember there being some good ones in the living room." Evangeline released his hand and skipped past me into the house with the fearless confidence of a child who'd never learned to doubt her welcome anywhere. I watched her go, then looked at Kirk with questions I was afraid to ask. "Mandy doesn't know she's here," he said quietly. "She thinks Evangeline is at my sister's for the afternoon." "Kirk, she's leaving, Mom. Tonight."
She packed 2 suitcases and bought a plane ticket to Seattle. She says she needs space to think, but we both know she's running. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What about Evangeline? The baby? She wanted to take Evangeline with her. His jaw tightened. I said no. We stood on my front porch in the gathering dusk, listening to Evangeline's delighted exclamations as she discovered my collection of children's books, the same ones I'd read to Kirk decades ago, kept carefully preserved in the hope that someday I'd have grandchildren to share them with. How much does she know? I asked about Phoenix. Everything. I confronted her with the newspaper articles, the witness testimony you mentioned. At first, she tried to deny it, but when I told her about the detective, Kirk shook his head. She broke down, admitted to taking the money, said she was desperate, that her student loans were crushing her, and she saw an opportunity. And the medication? The neglect? Kirk's face darkened. She claims that was unintentional, says she was overworked, understaffed, that mistakes happen in nursing homes. But Mom, when she was talking about it, when she was trying to justify what she did, I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Something cold. I thought of Vivian Schmidt, dying alone, in pain, while Mandy sold her medication for profit. Some lines, once crossed, change you forever. She keeps saying she's not that person anymore, that she was young and scared and made mistakes, but that was 7 years ago. Kirk leaned against my porch railing, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. But if she could do that to a helpless old woman, if she could steal from someone she trusted, what else is she capable of? Through the window, I could see Evangeline curled in my reading chair, a picture book open on her lap. She looked so small, so innocent, caught between adults whose choices would shape her entire future. What are you going to do? I asked. I don't know. Part of me thinks I should let her go, file for divorce, get custody of Evangeline, start over. But then I think about the baby, about splitting up the family. He ran his hands through his hair and that familiar gesture of frustration. And I think about you, about how she systematically pushed you out of our lives, and I wonder what kind of man that makes me for letting it happen. You couldn't have known, couldn't I? You tried to tell me. In your way. Not about Feener.
You didn't know about that then, but about how she was changing things between us. I chose to believe her version of events instead of trusting my own mother. His voice carried the weight of deep regret. I let her convince me that you were the problem. Evangeline appeared in the doorway, holding a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Grandma Alice, will you read this to me? Daddy says you used to read it to him when he was little. I looked at Kirk, who nodded almost imperceptibly. I'd love to, sweetheart. We settled on the living room sofa, Evangeline tucked against my side with the easy affection of a child who never learned to withhold love. As I read about Max's journey to the land of wild things, I felt something inside me begin to thaw, a part of my heart I'd kept frozen in self-protection, afraid to hope for moments like this. Kirk sat across from us, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read, when Evangeline dozed off against my shoulder midway through the story. He spoke quietly. She loves you already, even though she barely knows you. Even though Mandy spent years trying to make her forget you existed. I stroked Evangeline's silky hair, marveling at how perfectly she fit in the curve of my arm. Children have good instincts about people, don't they? Because Evangeline loves Mandy too. Adores her, actually. What's that going to do to her when she finds out her mother is? He couldn't finish the sentence. A criminal, I finished for him. Someone who hurt an innocent person for money. Kirk flinched but didn't argue. The detective called me this morning. He wants to interview Evangeline and me tomorrow to establish a timeline of when Mandy came to our state, how she presented her past to us. He says it's routine when they're building a case,
but it feels like we're betraying her. Are you? I asked. Or are you finally telling the truth? Before Kurt could answer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression darkened. Text from Mandy. Her flight leaves in 2 hours. She wants to know if I've come to my senses yet. And have you? Kirk looked at Evangeline, sleeping peacefully against my chest, then at me. You know what convinced me finally? It wasn't the evidence about Phoenix, as damning as that is. It was remembering Evangeline's second birthday party. I frowned, searching my memory. I wasn't invited to that. Exactly. Mandy said you were sick, that you'd called to cancel, but later, when I mentioned it to Janice, she said she'd seen you working in your garden that afternoon. You weren't sick at all. The memory came back in a rush of pain. I'd spent that entire day wondering what I'd done wrong, why my granddaughter's birthday celebration was happening without me. I'd called twice to ask if I could bring by Evangeline's gift, but Mandy had made excuses each time. She lied about something small and cruel for no reason except to hurt you, Kurt continued. And if she could do that, if she could look me in the eye and lie about my mother being sick to keep you away from your own granddaughter's birthday? He shook his head. What else has she lied about? What else have I believed? Because I wanted to trust my wife more than I wanted to protect my family. Evangeline stirred in my arms, making soft, sleepy sounds. I adjusted my position carefully, not wanting to wake her, not wanting this moment to end. There's something else, Kirk said, lowering his voice even further. I checked our bank records today. The college fund Mandy set up for Evangeline, the one she said came from her grandmother's inheritance. The deposits match exactly with the dates when Vivian Schmidt's money went missing. The words hung in the air between us like a physical weight. Evangeline's future built on the suffering of a dying woman? The cruel poetry of it made my stomach turn. I can't let her take Evangeline, Kirk said finally. I can't let my daughter grow up not knowing that her mother is capable of... He shook his head, unable to name the magnitude of Mandy's betrayal. And the baby. Kirk's hand went instinctively to his phone, where Mandy's text still waited for a response. I don't know. Mandy's 7 months pregnant. If she goes to prison, she made her choices, Kirk, 7 years ago. And again, when she decided to run rather than face the consequences. But the baby didn't make any choices. Neither did Evangeline. I looked down at my granddaughter's sleeping face, so peaceful and trusting. No, they didn't. But sometimes protecting children means making hard choices about the adults who claim to love them. Kirk stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where his wife might already be heading to the airport, carrying his unborn child toward an uncertain future. When he turned back to me, his expression was resolved. I need to make some phone calls. And tomorrow, when the detective interviews us, I'm going to tell him everything I know. 6 months later, I sat in the same courtroom where Mandy's fate had been decided 3 weeks earlier. The wooden benches were polished to a golden sheen, and autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the floor. Today wasn't about criminal proceedings. Those had concluded with Mandy's plea agreement and sentencing. Today was about custody, about the future of 2 children who'd become pawns in their parents' war. Mandy sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her pregnancy now obvious, even beneath the shapeless fabric. She'd given birth to Kirk Jr. 2 months ago in the prison infirmary, and the baby had been placed temporarily with Clara while the courts decided his permanent fate. Mandy's face was drawn, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that made her look older than her 32 years. She hadn't looked at me once since entering the room. Kirk sat with his lawyer on the opposite side, Evangeline beside him, in a green dress I'd bought for her. At 4 years old, she was too young to understand the legal intricacies, but old enough to sense that her world was being reshaped by adult decisions she had no power to influence. Helen Gahn had flown in from Phoenix to testify during the criminal trial. Seeing her on the witness stand, a small, dignified woman in her 50s, who'd carried the weight of Vivian Smith's death for 7 years, had been both heartbreaking and vindicating. She'd spoken clearly about watching Mandy withhold pain medication, about the falsified records, about the money she'd seen Mandy pocket from Vivian's purse. Her testimony had been devastating in its quiet precision. The witness spoke with compassion about Mrs. Schmidt's final weeks. Detective Rubin had told me afterward. She said Vivian kept asking for her medicine, kept saying the pain was unbearable. Your daughter-in-law told her that Medicare wouldn't cover the stronger doses, but she was selling those same pills to dealers outside the facility. Mandy had ultimately pleaded guilty to elder abuse, theft, and drug trafficking in exchange for a reduced sentence of 4 years. She'd be eligible for parole in 2.5 years, assuming good behavior. It was less than Vivi deserved, but more than I dared hope for when I'd first opened that manila envelope at the baby shower. The family court judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the case files with methodical care. Mrs. Jones, she addressed Mandy directly. You understand that your conviction for crimes involving vulnerable adults affects your parental rights? Mandy's lawyer, a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit, stood. Your Honor, my client acknowledges her past mistakes, but maintains that she poses no danger to her own children. She's completed parenting classes in the county facility and has expressed deep remorse for her actions. Deep remorse. The phrase hung in the air like incense at a funeral, meant to purify, but ultimately hollow. I remembered Mandy's face during her sentencing, how she'd wept and spoken about rehabilitation and second chances, but I also remembered her eyes when she'd first seen Vivian's photograph at the baby shower. Those eyes had held no remorse, only terror at being discovered. Mr. Jones, the judge turned to Kirk. You're seeking full custody of both children? Kirk stood, his hand briefly touching Evangeline's shoulder. Yes, Your Honor. I believe it's in their best interests. And you understand the financial and emotional responsibilities involved in raising your wife's child from prison? Kirk Jr. is my son too, Your Honor. Biology doesn't determine love. I felt a surge of pride watching my son speak those words. Whatever mistakes he'd made in trusting Mandy, whatever blindness had allowed him to push me out of his life, he was reclaiming his integrity. Now the man speaking in this courtroom was the boy I'd raised, the one who'd helped injured birds and defended smaller children from bullies, who'd believed that protecting the vulnerable was not a choice, but a duty. Mandy finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Your Honor, I know I made terrible mistakes, but I love my children. I want to be part of their lives. The judge studied her with the expression of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human failure and redemption. Mrs. Jones, loving your children and being capable of safely parenting them are not necessarily the same thing. Your actions in Arizona demonstrated a willingness to exploit vulnerable people for financial gain. The court must consider whether that pattern of behavior poses a risk to your own vulnerable children. That was different, Mandy said, her voice gaining strength. Vivian wasn't my family. I would never hurt Evangeline or Kirk Jr. The words fell into the courtroom silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that reached every corner of the room. Even Mandy's lawyer looked stricken by what she'd just said, that somehow Vivian Schmidt's suffering mattered less because she wasn't family, that blood relation was the only thing standing between her children and the cruelty she'd shown a dying old woman. I thought of Vivian in those final weeks, probably crying out in pain while Mandy counted the money she'd made from selling her medication. I thought of the bed sores that had killed her, infected, because Mandy hadn't provided the care she was paid to give. Vivian had been someone's daughter once, someone's granddaughter. She deserved better than dying alone while her caregiver saw her only as a source of profit. Mrs. Jones. The judge's voice was ice cold.
The fact that you see a distinction between exploiting Mrs. Schmidt and potentially exploiting your own children tells me everything I need to know about your fitness as a parent. Mandy's face crumbled, but I felt no satisfaction in watching her break. This wasn't about my personal revenge anymore. It was about justice for Vivian and protection for Evangeline and Kirk Jr. My feelings had become irrelevant somewhere along the way, consumed by something larger and more necessary than my own hurt. The judge delivered her ruling with crisp efficiency. Full custody to Kirk, with Mandy granted supervised visits once she was released from prison. The visits would be conditional on her completing psychological evaluation and parenting rehabilitation programs. Clara would retain temporary custody of Kirk Jr. until Kirk could make arrangements for both children. As the court officer led Mandy away, she turned to look at me for the first time in months. Her eyes held a mixture of hatred and something that might have been understanding, a recognition that I'd outplayed her completely, that my patience and methodical planning had dismantled her life as systematically as she'd once dismantled mine. "This isn't over," she mouthed silently. I smiled, the same smile I'd worn at the baby shower, calm and implacable. "Yes," I mouthed back, "it is." Kirk drove Evangeline and I home in silence that felt different from the angry quiet that had characterized our family for so long. This silence held the possibility of peace, of relationships that could be rebuilt on foundations of truth instead of lies. "Is Mommy Mandy going to be sad for a long time?" Evangeline asked as we pulled into my driveway. Kirk glanced at me in the rearview mirror, looking for guidance. I'd become his co-parent by necessity, the grandmother who'd stepped in to help him navigate single parenthood and the complex emotions of raising children whose mother was in prison. "Yes, sweetheart," I said gently. "She's going to be sad for a while, but sometimes people have to face consequences for the choices they make, even when those consequences make everyone sad." "Like then I have to sit in timeout for hitting?" "Something like that, yes." Evangeline nodded with the solemn acceptance children bring to life's incomprehensible adult complications. She'd been seeing a child psychologist to help her process the changes in her family, and Pamela had been encouraged by her resilience. Children, she told us, were remarkably adaptable when the adult in their lives provided consistency and love. That evening, after Evangeline was asleep in what had become her regular bedroom at my house, Kirk and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset. He'd moved back into his childhood home temporarily while sorting out the logistics of his new life, selling the house he'd shared with Mandy, arranging childcare for 2 children, building a support system that could sustain them all. "Do you think she'll really change?" he asked, referring to Mandy. "In prison with all the programs they're making her take?" I considered the question seriously. I think prison changes everyone. Whether it makes them better or just better at hiding who they really are, that remains to be seen. Part of me hopes she will, for the kid's sake if nothing else. Kirk Jr. deserves to have a mother who can love him without conditions. I thought of Vivian Schmidt again, dying in pain while Mandy sold her medication. Some lines, once crossed, change you permanently. The question isn't whether Mandy will be different when she gets out. The question is whether she was always capable of what she did to Vivian, and you just didn't see it. Kirk was quiet for a long time, processing this. I've been thinking about that a lot, about the signs I must have missed, the red flags I ignored because I was in love. We see what we want to see in people we love, or what they want us to see. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting on my porch discussing my daughter-in-law's prison sentence while planning to raise my son's children, I'd have thought they were describing someone else's life. But here we were, having built something new from the wreckage of Mandy's lies, a family held together not by blood alone, but by the conscious choice to protect and love each other.
My phone buzzed with the text from Pamela. Evangeline's doing wonderfully. Her sense of security is growing every day. Whatever you and Kirk are doing, keep it up. I showed Kirk the message, and he smiled. The first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since this all began. "We're going to be okay," he said, and for the first time in months, I believed him. Justice had been served, Vivian Schnitt could rest in peace, and my family, broken and rebuilt, scarred but stronger, would endure. Now, tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.